Lack of bread, according to the People's Commissariat of Agriculture, was determined at 180 million poods. For needy subnational provinces, excess bread, 655 million poods. The existing surplus of bread, with proper distribution, covered the need for it completely. It was necessary to establish this distribution. The resulting difficult situation with the provision of bread to the urban population can be illustrated by the following data. In Moscow, for example, in January 1918 only 180 wagons arrived. The demand for bread, with a ration rate of only a quarter of a pound per day, was determined at 16 to 17 wagons per day. That is, it was required for a month almost 3 times more than what was received. Every day Moscow received 10, 11 wagons less. The lack of flour was replenished with loans and commissary, accidentally waggled cars, meager supplies left for January, and surrogates. Moscow has not experienced such a difficult situation yet. Social Democrat, number 26 of February 17, 1918. One of the objectives of the food policy was the proper distribution of available food supplies. For this purpose, a card system was introduced in the cities. A special accounting and control apparatus was created, which took into account the receipt and sale of products on the cards in stores and shops. In August-September 1918, a class ration was introduced in Moscow and other large cities. Consumers were divided into 4 categories. The first category included consumers who perform particularly hard work. The second category included persons of ordinary physical labor, as well as sick and children. The third category includes all employees, representatives of the so-called free professions, as well as adult family members of all workers and employees. The fourth category included all other citizens. According to the resolution of the People's Commissariat of Food on October 19, 1918, the following monthly norms for the provision of bread products to consumers of these 4 categories were established. For persons of the first category, 36 pounds, the second category, 25 pounds, the third, 18 pounds and the fourth, 12 pounds. Lenin attached great importance to consumer cooperation as a distribution apparatus. He believed that not only consumer, but also other types of cooperation created under capitalism, are those apparatus that the dictatorship of the proletariat must necessarily use. The management of cooperation of all kinds was at that time in the hands of bourgeois and petty bourgeois elements. Among them there were many Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. They did not miss the opportunity to use the cooperative apparatus as an instrument of struggle against the Soviet power. This was one of the additional difficulties of the Soviet food policy. Despite this, the Soviet authorities very carefully approached the cooperative apparatus. Cooperative workers were invited to discuss the first decree of the Soviet government on consumer cooperation. The decree on consumer cooperative organizations was adopted on April 10, March 28, 1918. According to the decree, within the limits of each locality, a territorial section, no more than 2 consumer cooperatives can operate. A general civil and class worker collection of legislation and orders for 1918, number 32, art. 418. Members of the cooperative were required to pay an entrance fee, which is minimal for persons who are not more than 50 kopecks. All trading enterprises had to pay a special tax, 5% of turnover. Members of cooperatives were exempt from this tax, receiving 5% of the amount of their fence upon approval of the annual report. The decree also established that the management of cooperatives cannot include owners and managers of commercial and industrial enterprises of a private capitalist nature, i.e. The decree established the need for reporting of cooperation to the Supreme Economic Council and the People's Commissariat of Food, as well as control over the cooperation activities of the latter. The last point of the decree established the possibility of attracting unions of consumer societies. to purchase, procure, process and produce products, on behalf of state procurement agencies and the Supreme Council of the National Economy, with the assistance of them and under their control. Ibid. On the ground, Lenin's policy on cooperation has not always been understood. In a number of provinces and cities there were cases of requisition and confiscation of property and goods of cooperatives, as well as cases of dissolution of cooperative associations. All kinds of obstacles to their activities were put. The Council of People's Commissars has repeatedly suppressed such anti-state practice. Lenin repeatedly explained in his speeches that the refusal to use cooperation would be the embodiment of short-sightedness and stupidity. The heavy food situation required the most vigorous, effective measures for strengthening grain procurements. These measures included the promotion of industrial goods to the village in order to stimulate the procurement and production of bread. On April 2, March 20, 1918, the decree of the Council of People's Commissars on the organization of commodity exchange for strengthening grain procurement was published, which was later supplemented by the decree of August 5 on mandatory commodity exchange in rural areas. The organization of commodity exchange on a national scale was entrusted to the People's Commissariat of Food, which was a centralized state apparatus for the procurement and distribution of food. For food exchange goods, fabrics, threads, haberdashery, leather, saddle rye, shoes, galoshes, matches, soap, candles, kerosene, lubricating oil, agricultural machinery and other items were used. Under the instructions of the People's Commissariat of Food, the goods were transferred to provincial and district food authorities in accordance with the size of state grain and other blanks. On the ground, they were distributed among all those in need to induce the poor to work on having bread, forcing them to surrender. A systematic collection of decrees and government orders for food, Book 1, p. 150. A special commodity exchange fund was created. Inventories of consumer goods were registered. On the ground, their commodity exchange funds were created. In there, for example, the stocks of the manufactory and the factories of Morozov, Bergen-Zalogan were inspected and taken into account. It turned out that in addition to the intendant reserves, 9.2 million arshins, the army and the People's Commissariat of Food, 3.6 million arshins. In one Ver factory there were 4.5 million arshins. In Christmas, about 700,000 arshins. Pravda from 16/3 January 1918. In June, July 1918, the decrees of the Council of People's Commissars on the purchase and distribution of fabrics and on the monopoly on fabrics were issued, according to which all fabrics that were in wholesale and factory warehouses were placed at the disposal of the state. Commodity funds of the state were created in a fierce class struggle with the capitalists, saboteurs and speculators. The food situation was especially aggravated after Ukraine was occupied by German troops in March 1918. In May, the insurrection of Czechoslovakians, organized by Anglo-French imperialism, which had cut off from the RSFSR Siberia, which had huge grain surpluses, the Urals and part of the Volga region, began. In the hands of the White Guards there were also significant quantities of goods sent by the People's Commissariat of Food to the grain areas for trade with the peasantry. In May 1918 the German occupation forces continued to move to the east and south, capturing Rostov-on-Don, Crimea, Transcaucasia. The Soviet, wedged between the Siberian and southern counter-revolutions, the provinces of the Volga region and the North Caucasus with a center in Tsaritsyn, was becoming narrower. These areas have become of great importance for the young Soviet Republic as the only rich grain district, not to mention the colossal strategic importance of Tsaritsyn. The kulaks and other bourgeois elements, using the need and hunger of the broad masses for personal enrichment, developed rabid speculation in grain. The kulaks inflated prices and refused to sell bread at fixed prices. Often, They generally refused to sell bread for money and demanded payment in kind, goods. Large and small speculators predators appeared on the arena of economic life. In cooperative shops there were no goods, but the turnover of the Sukharevsky market in Moscow, which was the center of speculation, rose to monstrous proportions. Large speculators bought grain in the grain-growing regions and, with the aim of speculation, delivered it to Moscow, Petrograd and other cities. Small speculators and hired agents of large predator speculators brought goods to the village and bread from the village on their own shoulders in passenger carriages. Along with consumer purchases in the village of bread workers and employees developed speculative sacking. The wave of bag makers loaded the transport to failure, and this made the situation even more difficult. In this exceptionally difficult situation, the party and the Soviet government headed by Lenin and Stalin bravely pursued a firm, iron proletarian policy of ruthless struggle against the raging elements of kulak speculation, for the proletarian grain monopoly. The struggle for bread is promoted as the next slogan of the party and the Soviet government. To get bread means to save millions of starving people, to save the basis of socialism, large-scale industry. Extraordinary, heroic measures were needed to combat the impending horror of hunger threatening the revolution. In this struggle, Lenin explained, the working class should show examples of organization, cohesion, fortitude and lead the proletarian and semi-proletarian masses of the poorest peasantry. The unification of the workers, the organization of the workers' detachments, the organization of the hungry from the non-agricultural hungry counties, we call them for help. Our food commissariat addresses them, we say, to the crusade for bread, the crusade against speculators, against the kulaks, for the restoration of order. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXIII, p. 57-58. The party believed that the struggle for bread was a struggle for socialism. The main enemy was a speculator and a fist. On behalf of speculators and kulaks, defending their sacred right to free trade, the petty bourgeois parties of the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, including the lefts who were in a secret bloc with the treacherous group of Bukharin, appeared. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, who settled in various food administrations, openly pursued anti-Soviet policies. In November and December 1917 they demanded the neutrality and apoliticalness of the food authorities, their independence from the Soviet government. In practice, this neutrality was expressed in the organization of sabotage in the food apparatus. This counter-revolutionary demand for the neutrality of the food authorities was put forward in a more disguised form in the following months. Rykov, Kamenev and other capitulators took up the Menshevik position in the food question. They defended the independence of elected food organizations, the restriction of the rights of the People's Commissariat of Trade, and so on. The strikebreaker of the Socialist Revolution, along with other traders, conducted a policy of agreement on the food question with the sworn enemies of the revolution, the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries. The positions of Rykov and Kamenev on the food question were therefore designed to disrupt the Bolshevik struggle for socialism. The great danger to the cause of the revolution was represented by local and separatist tendencies on the ground and anti-state, essentially syndicalist tendencies of some trade union leaders and individual enterprises. The opportunists, who did not want to enter into a difficult and dangerous struggle against the kulaks, went along the line of least resistance. They arbitrarily raised the price of bread. Such facts took place in a number of grain districts of the Saratov, Kazan, Tambov and other provinces. This, of course, did not alleviate the matter of procurement, but disrupted the state plans. Local tendencies were manifested, in addition, in the delay of harvested bread, in the failure to fulfill orders for loading, and so on. A number of trade unions and even individual enterprises strenuously sought the right to independently procure bread. The petty bourgeois elements in the working class sought to independently launch, in exchange for bread, the products of their enterprises. On June 16, in this spirit, an emergency meeting was held at the workers' factory of the Boghorodsko-Glukhovskaya Manufactory, Mozablarhiv, fund of the Council of Workers' Deputies of Boghorodsko-Glukhovskaya Manufactory, number 55, F3. In May 1918, a number of trade unions, railwaymen, water workers, metal workers and food committees of a number of starving provinces and counties applied to the Council of People's Commissars with a request to allow them to make independent grain procurements. In response, the Council of People's Commissars, on the proposal of Lenin, adopted a special resolution, which said, "Separate independent procurement, the death of the entire food business, the death of the revolution, collapse, disintegration." The allocation of thousands of employees and workers of the best and most devoted people to the detachments in order to draw up a common working force for the establishment of order, for assistance and supervision, for collecting all surplus grain, for a complete victory over speculation, only this is salvation. Lenin Collector Eggs 8, p. 106. The appeal of the Council of People's Commissars, May 29, 1918, to workers and peasants on the organization of armed detachments for the struggle against the enemies of the people and the peasant bourgeoisie ended with the following slogans: "Not a step away from the grain monopoly. Not the slightest increase in hard bread prices. There are no independent blanks. All is sustained and disciplined and conscious in a single organized food system. Unconditional execution of all instructions of the central authority. No separate actions. Full revolutionary order in the country. War to the kulaks. IBID, p. 100. Such were the main slogans of the food policy of the Soviet government. To implement them, a strong centralized food apparatus with authority and extraordinary powers was to be created. Such apparatus became the People's Commissariat of Food. Along with the Supreme Economic Council, it became the most important economic and political apparatus of the Soviet government. On May 9, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee decided on the emergency powers of the People's Commissariat of Food, the so-called Decree on the Food Dictatorship, the draft of which was drafted by Lenin. While discussing this decree, Rykov, co-rapporteur, from the regional food organizations, made a sharp rebuff at the meeting of the Council of People's Commissars, who developed a whole bourgeois restorative program of actions, raising bread prices, in the form of a fee and a prize for transportation of bread, attracting private traders to grain procurement. Rykov acted as the direct defender of the kulaks, the mouthpiece of the counter-revolution. The Mensheviks, Dan and the left socialist revolutionaries, Kamkov, opposed the decree on the food dictatorship. It is characteristic that these enemies of socialism did not think to oppose the slogan of the grain monopoly at a time when Kerensky was in power, who carried out this monopoly in the interests of the bourgeoisie. Now, when the grain monopoly became the instrument of the dictatorship of the working class, when it was enforced by the workers themselves in alliance with the rural poor, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries emerged as enemies of the grain monopoly and defenders of the bourgeoisie and the kulaks. Under the decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of May 9, April 26, 1918, the People's Commissariat of Food received extraordinary powers. The violence of the bread owners over the starving poor, the answer must be violence against the bourgeoisie. Read the decree, Collection of Laws and Orders of 1918, number 35, art. 468. The decree confirmed the inviolability of the grain monopoly and the need for ruthless struggle against grain speculators, bag makers. All workers and the poorest peasants were called upon to fight the kulaks, fist saboteurs who did not surrender grain surpluses, or declared enemies of the people. The perpetrators were to be brought to trial and imprisoned for a period of not less than 10 years, with confiscation of property. Self-guards were sentenced to forced labor. The People's Commissariat of Food has the right to issue resolutions that go beyond the usual range of food issues, to cancel decisions of local food organizations, institutions and organizations if they contradict the provisions of the People's Commissariat of Food, demand that all agencies and organizations of all departments unconditionally implement the orders of the People's Commissariat of Food, to use armed force in case of counteraction to the orders of the People's Commissariat of Food on the ground, dismiss and bring to justice, to arrest officials and employees of all departments and public organizations in the event of their disruptive interference with the orders of the People's Commissariat of Food. On May 27, 1918, the decree of the Central Executive Committee on the reorganization of the People's Commissariat of Food and local food bodies was issued, which further expanded the functions of the People's Commissariat of Food to organize the supply of the population with all basic necessities and foodstuffs on a national scale and prepare a transition to the nationalization of trade and basic necessities. This was how the task of the People's Commissariat of Food and its organs was defined. The People's Commissariat of Food, according to the decree, had the right to give instructions to all central bodies regulating the production and distribution of essential goods. Institutions and bodies with distributive functions were transferred to the jurisdiction of the People's Commissariat of Food. The People's Commissariat of Food and the Supreme Council of National Economy set prices for essentials. The distribution was handled by local bodies of the People's Commissariat of Food with the participation of cooperation. Provincial, regional and district food committees were created, as bodies of Soviets of workers, soldiers and peasants' deputies. The organization of food detachments was decreed. All the work of the food bodies was based on working food detachments, which in the village acted in conjunction with the poor organizations. The combatives organized by decree on June 11, May 29, 1918. The workers and the rural poor carried out the crusade for bread, the crusade against the kulaks, which Lenin urged. The workers' detachments appeared in the village in many cases as organizers of the village poor's committees. Workers' detachments acted not only in the countryside, but also on the railways and steamships. Often they had joined parts of our Red Army and took part in the struggle against the White Guard hordes. To the mighty movement of the workers' detachments, various dark elements also applied. Bribe takers, thieves, speculators. Lenin called for the most merciless eradication of elements of criminality and corruption, even to be shot. And such a struggle was conducted by the bodies of the Cheka. Workers' detachments did a heroic job. Here are some examples. A detachment of 60 people accompanied to Tsaritsyn a cargo consisting of 23 cars with agricultural machinery. Near Tsaritsyn the Belarus gangs prevented the advance of the train. They made raids, blasted the canvas of the railway. The detachment had to engage in a skirmish with the bandits. At the station Rakovka the train got off the rails, as the bandits blew up the railroad tracks and attacked the detachment. An armored train came to the aid of the detachment, and only thus the attack was repulsed. The next night near Lipki station the train was again detained. The battle with the white bands continued all night. Thus, the cargo was delivered to the destination, in Tsaritsyn. In exchange for the cars, the detachment received in Tsaritsyn 30 carriages of fish for Moscow. On the way back, the same thing happened again. At the station Filonovo the train was surrounded by white bands. The battle was from 1 am to 11 am. Ahead of the bandits was dismantled the road for 3 miles. Several people were killed and wounded in the battle. Pravda, dated July 23, 1918. In the leadership of the food policy of the Soviet government, the role of Comrade Stalin was exceptionally great, which became the head of the crusade declared by the party, the campaign of millions of workers and poor peasants against the kulaks, and bread for the starving country. Comrade Stalin was at the most responsible, the most important site, in Tsaritsyn. the center of the southeast bread districts, the only large tank of bread not occupied by the White Guards. The decision of the Council of People's Commissars on the delegation of Comrade Stalin as general manager of the food business in the south of Russia was held on May 29, 1918, and already in the June 11 address of the Council of People's Commissars, the first results of the work of Comrade Stalin, to the aid of the starving north comes the southeast. The People's Commissar Stalin, who was in Tsaritsyn and who runs food work there on the Don and in the Kuban, teaches us about the enormous stocks of grain that he hopes to send to the north in the coming weeks. Proletarian Revolution, Number 7, 1936, p. 67. The activities of Comrade Stalin in Tsaritsyn were by no means limited to the food business. Stalin was in Tsaritsyn an authorized representative of the Central Committee, a member of the Revolutionary Military Council, and the leader of party and Soviet work. He stood at the head of the defense of Tsaritsyn from the White Guard hordes. In the field of food, his work was of great importance. His telegrams from Tsaritsyn to Lenin's name introduce us into the thick of the principled and practical issues of food policy. Here is one of these remarkable historical documents. Here is Comrade Stalin's telegram sent to Lenin on June 7, 1918. On the 6th I arrived in Tsaritsyn. Despite the confusion in all spheres of economic life, it is still possible to restore order. In Tsaritsyn, Astrakhan, in Saratov, monopolies and fixed prices are abolished by the Soviets. There is a bacchanalia in speculation. Achieve the introduction of a card system and solid prices in Tsaritsyn. The same must be achieved in Astrakhan and Saratov, otherwise through these valves of speculation will drain all the bread. Let the CEC and the Council of People's Commissars in turn demand that the Soviets renounce speculation. Railway transport is completely destroyed by the efforts of many colleges and revolutionary committees. I am compelled to put special commissioners who are already putting in order, despite the protests of the colleges. The commissars open a bunch of locomotives in places the colleges do not suspect exist. The study showed that 8 or more block trains can be launched on the Tsaritsyn-Poverino-Balashov-Kozlov in Moscow line a day. Now he is busy accumulating trains in Tsaritsyn. A week later, we will announce the Bread Week, and we will immediately start about 1 million poods with special escorts from the railway workers, as I will inform you in advance. In water transport, the hitching due to the non-exclusion of ships by Nizhny Novgorod, in connection with the Czechoslovaks. Give an order for the immediate release of steamers to Tsaritsyn, IBID, p. 74. In Tsaritsyn, free trade in grain was in full swing. Bread in huge lots flowed into the hands of speculators. The bread resources of the only bread-growing region that was accessible to the country were criminally squandered, at a time when the population of Moscow and Petrograd was starving. Comrade Stalin began with the introduction of the card system and the establishment of firm prices. Closure of the channels of speculative leakage of bread was a necessary condition for the success of grain procurements. The practical results of the work of Comrade Stalin in Tsaritsyn in the field of food business are seen from the following figures. In 1 month, June, 2,279 carriages of food, mostly grain, cargo were sent from Tsaritsyn to Moscow, Petrograd and other working centers. This does not include shipments sent by water, as well as goods sent not from Tsaritsyn, but from other stations in the southeast. The significance of this figure will become clear, given that this bread was sent in June, at the most difficult time before the implementation of a new crop. The counter-revolution failed to strangle the socialist revolution with famine. In one of the most difficult moments, in the summer of 1918, the Soviet country was saved from starvation by the remarkable heroic work and ingenious leadership of Lenin and Stalin. Since August 1918 a new period in food policy has begun, connected with the harvesting and sale of a new crop. The development of the Civil War put the Soviet country in front of new difficulties and dangers.